Okay, so now the dopamine system then is sort of like an error system. It is tracking the concept of better than expected. So we come upon things and they're better than expected, the dopamine system is going to light up. But what about back to our goals? Where are goals generated and maintained? And it's here, it's believed that the frontal cortex is critical for forming goals, selecting appropriate behaviors, maintaining short-term goals so that you can reach the goal, and so on. And some evidence for this comes from brain damage patients. Lesions to a certain part of the frontal cortex create patients that have difficulty in maintaining their goals for long enough to achieve them. They're easily distracted, and they do not plan well. They do not respond to other things that might come up in the environment. They're not able to react, to go around obstacles so as to still achieve their goals. Psychologists use a term called cognitive control, and this is when you're using internally represented goals to guide a sequence of actions. And again, the frontal lobes seem involved in this, as damage to these areas impair that ability. So let's see how this is a model of Montague, how Montague sees the frontal cortex and what it's doing for goals. Okay, so let's take a look at this diagram here. On the left, then, we would have the prefrontal cortex, and we've got three goals sort of that are possible. Let's say in a situation, goal A, B, C. It's the job of the prefrontal cortex to select one of these goals and maintain it for the purposes of guiding behavior. So we can imagine a competition happening, just as we saw in our study of consciousness, the competition between, say, the up Necker cube and down cube interpretation, and as we saw in the free will unit, that there are all kinds of unconscious neural circuits that are competing for access, in this case to motor systems, but also access to consciousness. So here we have a winning goal. And this is the one, then, if behavior is going to be carried out to reach that goal, the goal has to be stabilized. And so he uses the metaphor of sort of putting a shield up around the goal. So there's some system in the brain that can stabilize the goal, can protect the goal from distractions and other things that might interfere with behavior towards reaching the goal. Now, Montague is going to argue that the dopamine system interacts with this prefrontal cortex system. Remember that dopamine neurons project to the prefrontal cortex. He's going to call it the dopamine gating hypothesis, that the dopamine system acts as a gating mechanism to regulate information reaching the prefrontal cortex. So the cortex is going to select one pattern of neural activity from among several competing patterns. So the dopamine system is going to be involved in selecting and maintaining the things that we call goals. So the dopamine system select patterns so that it stabilizes those selected patterns so that it can act as a goal. And it uses the goal as feedback signals to control other brain regions. So what would that look like on our diagram? So here we have, again, here's our goal A has been protected by the frontal system here, but and here is the dopamine cell here showing this is baseline activity here. So this is the connection between ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens and the frontal cortex. Look at what has happened, though. While we had goal A being protected and maintained for the purpose of behavior, maybe we encounter some new stimulus that has previously achieved high value. Well, the dopamine system is going to say, aha, that's better than expected. And so activity in the dopamine system can bring the shield down. So previously we had goal A, but we just encountered something awesome in the environment, something better than expected, brings the shield down. And now it allows the cortex to have another competition for a new goal. The old goal might still be competing, but now there's the potential for a new goal to win. Right? So again, the big idea here is that the dopamine system is interacting with the frontal system to change our goals based on the valuation of the stimulus, whatever it was. So we're assuming here that it was something of value. It has previously earned that award of being better than expected. Well, in the end, new goal B does win. And so now, with goal B stabilized, the shield is up, back to baseline levels of dopamine. Now the brain is seeking the valued stimulus or whatever is connected to it down the road, some kind of good thing, like juice was with the light. So again, the dopamine system is interacting with the frontal system. The frontal system is where the goals are generated, and they compete, and then they're stabilized for the purposes of behavioral control. The dopamine system can take down that protection and initiate a competition for a new goal, and then protect the new goal so that we can act. Okay, so now we can think about how the dopamine system is involved in addiction. Here's what Montague has to say on addiction. Addiction is all a matter of mistaken identity in the form of false value. Keep the light predicts juice scenario in mind. Once the value assigned to the light predicts the time and reward value of juice, the reinforcement learning system stops learning about the juice. Substances like cocaine never let this happen because they sidestep the checks and balances that allow the system to stop learning about natural rewards once they are adequately predicted. Instead, each cocaine hit continues to cause a dopamine burst, signaling the system that something with extra value has just arrived, which is just another way of saying something better than expected has just arrived. For juice, the system eventually learns to stop signaling this because it learns the value of the juice. But since cocaine always causes a little dopamine burst, the reinforcement learning system thinks that there is more value still to learn about. So every cocaine hit impresses upon the brain that this is something better than expected, so the brain keeps increasing the value of that thing. Now Montague goes on to wonder whether ideas can be addicting in a sense. And so for those ideas that are the sort of the reasons for movements around the world, for example, Montague's going to look at that through the lens of the dopamine system. That ideas like democracy and freedom and human rights and religious devotion and moral rectitude, these are things that people will do a lot to spread and enforce. And so the idea is that these concepts are being given sort of high value by the dopamine system. And that when we ponder these things, it's a better than expected state of affairs. However, not all ideas are the same or equally valuable. And here he begins to differentiate between some ideas and some goals are more valuable than others. Since we're biological creatures, of course it makes evolutionary sense that we would highly value finding food and water, sex, status, cooperation, punishment as social creatures, and so on. And so Montague believes that certain goals are going to have preferential access to the dopamine system so that they can bias our decision-making to meet these special goals. In other words, if the brain is going to be entertaining two goals, one of which is to find food and water, and the other of which is to play a game of chess or whatever, then certain goals are going to win the competition, all other things being equal. And he thinks this can be explained, again, by thinking of ideas as having different relations between the dopamine system. These goals and ideas that can win the competitions presumably have closer associations with the dopamine system. So they can get us to pursue those goals rather than alternative goals. A pictorial version of this is shown here. So again, in the prefrontal cortex, we might have some goals, A, B, and C, for just routine things we might do every day. But then there is this, Montague argues, a special category of goals: finding food, water, sex, status, etc. And so the idea here is that these goals are able to commandeer the dopamine system in a more effective way than alternative types of goals. And so if ever there's a competition between our mundane types of goals and these life-sustaining, critically important, evolutionarily important goals, the evolutionarily important goals will win. The explanation for how they would win is that they have a special relationship to the dopamine system. These things themselves become rewards in themselves. Of course, it's possible that other kinds of ideas can become very, very important. And this is how Montague understands people who would, for example, jeopardize their own life for the pursuit of a particular idea or ideal. So, which ideas have the power to drive us to do things even if it might kill us? It's possible that the prefrontal cortex filters some ideas that become rewards, or the dopamine system is selecting which ideas can act as rewards. Certainly in different cultures, different things are worth dying for, and so culture can tune those circuits. But evolutionary theory predicts there's going to be some constraint on the flexibility of that system. Not any old idea will be powerful enough to make us behave even at the cost of our own lives. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the research by Antonio Damasio, and he wrote a book some time ago called Descartes' Error, and it's about this issue of how we make decisions. And classically, Descartes, for example, it was understood that decisions were made through sort of cognitive systems, that it was all kind of intellectual. But recent research is showing a much greater role for emotions in our decision making. And so Damasio had an opportunity to study some patients with brain damage, and here's one of the tasks that he used to assess the role of the brain in decision making. So let's say we've got two decks of cards here, and there's a game that's going to be played here. The subject draws from a card from a deck, and according to what the card is, they will either receive some monetary reward, either high or low, or a monetary penalty. They will have to pay the bank some amount of money. Now, there are two decks shown here. Actually, Damasio used 4 decks, but we're going to simplify it to 2. Unbeknownst to the subject in the beginning of the experiment, one of the decks, we'll say this one, and I'm going to put it kind of crooked here, one of the decks was a risky deck. Now, as you drew through this deck, there were high rewards, but there were also high penalties. And so if you kept playing from this deck, kept drawing from this deck, overall, in the long run, you were going to owe more money than you gained. You're going to lose. The other deck had payoffs that were lower, but the penalties were lower as well, and so the long term was a positive gain. So we can think of this deck as a safe deck. Here's a risky deck, where sometimes in the short run you might pick a card and make a big gain. If you played consistently from this deck, you're going to lose in the long run. On the other hand, the safer deck, you're going to win in the long run, but any particular winning in the short term would be of reduced value compared to the other deck. All right. So Damasio just sort of let normal people play this game. And of course, assuming that most people want to maximize their winnings, they will just start picking randomly from each of the decks, but in time learn of the danger and riskiness of this deck. And normal people tend to then predominantly towards the end start choosing from the safer deck, and they can maximize their earnings in this way. So normal people show a certain kind of learning and about the payoffs of these two decks, and this influences their decision making as to which deck to choose from. Damasio then looked at the behavior of patients with certain lesions in the frontal part of the brain. like the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. These patients showed a different kind of experience with this game. They did not show the shift to the safer deck over time. They continued to draw from the risky deck. And the question then is, well, what's going on here? How is the brain involved in shaping our decisions? And how should we interpret the behavior of the brain-damaged subjects? Okay, so if we kind of zero in, here is a kind of graphical display of normal controls. And we'll just look at the two categories, the disadvantageous decks, that is long-term losing decks, high risk, long-term loss, and then the advantageous decks, lower payouts but long-term winners. So normal people, as you can see, as you go from the early trials to later trials in the same game, they start to shift the decks from which they choose. They start to increase their choices from the safer deck and decrease choices from the risky deck. The patients with brain damage in the frontal part of the brain show a different pattern. So notice here in the middle, there seems to be sort of equally likely to choose the deck, but then later on they're back to choosing the risky deck. It's as if they didn't learn about the reward outcomes of the decks, or if they did, they weren't using that information to guide their choices in a way that led to a better economic outcome. Patients with lesions here would end up losing the game. In fact, Damasio had many patients where they had made real-life economic decisions that were poor decisions, and they became bankrupt, for example. So in real life, decision-making for a ventromedial patient is compromised. It's not just in the laboratory. This shows here a record of a typical normal person that early on you might be choosing from the decks, including the risky decks. But as time goes on, the C and D here, notice the choices are predominantly on the safer decks. Occasionally you might go back to a risky deck, but for the most part, normal people play the safe odds here. And it's a winning strategy. They learn that that's how you can maximize your economic gain at the end. Whereas the ventromedial patients are showing a different pattern. They continue to play the risky decks towards the end of the game. Of course, they end up losing. So, ventromedial patients do not show normal behavior. They don't learn to avoid the risky decks. They have difficulty following a more beneficial long-term strategy. It's as if the short-term possibilities cannot be suppressed. Damasio generated a hypothesis from these results. These cannot be suppressed. Damasio generated a hypothesis from these results. He called it the somatic marker hypothesis. And the idea is that normal individuals learn to associate a negative consequence and the resulting emotion with the choice from risky decks. So, when you choose from the risky deck and you get burned, you see, we learn the actual consequence that I had to pay some money, but also the negative emotion gets linked up with that choosing the card from that particular deck. Right? Now the key step in the hypothesis here is so that then when we make future decisions, the emotion can serve as a warning. So the association can serve as a warning when making future decisions. So if I start to choose from the risky deck, I will, just prior to that, have that kind of negative emotional experience, and that might cause me to avoid choosing from the risky deck. So, for Damasio, each decision option carries with it an emotional tag that has been learned by experience. And this he calls a somatic marker, because it can be experienced as a bad feeling in the quote-unquote gut. But of course it can also be unconscious. So the emotional tag of any particular option may be consciously felt as a bad feeling that can consciously warn us, but it can also be unconscious, and it's just having its effects on our decision making out of our awareness. But it still makes sense to say that it has an emotional tag that is negative, in other words, that causes us to avoid the decision, but we might not be conscious of that. If this feeling is generated in advance of a decision, it can be used to avoid risky choices and direct selection to more favorable options. So for Damasio, he argues that it's the ventromedial prefrontal cortex where the reinforcement record of past decisions is stored. Of course, remember, memories are stored as changes in synapse strengths. So in other words, when people are learning about the risky deck, they are changing the synapse strengths associated with that object and associating that deck with a negative emotional experience. With learning, the stored decision values can be updated. Ventral medial patients cannot do this, and so cannot learn to avoid strategies that have negative consequences. They lack the somatic markers to guide decision making. Theo went on to gather more evidence for this kind of hypothesis by measuring skin conductance for the normal people and the brain damaged people. And when when our emotions are evoked, skin conductance increases. This is the basis of lie detectors. If we feel stress at lying, it can be detected in how sweaty we are. As we increase sweat on our skin, it increases the conductivity of two electrodes. Damasio hypothesized that skin conductance responses, SCRs as they're called, are an indication of the proper functioning of the somatic marker system. In normals, SCRs occur before a choice is made and can be used as a marker for a choice that was risky in the past. And so he wondered, do the ventral medial patients show the anticipatory SCRs? Right, so the idea is maybe normals are using that little feeling to guide their decision. If the feeling happens prior to actually making the decision, it may bias the decision towards the safer deck. So here's a record of the SCR magnitude. Normal controls over here, we see high levels of SCRs, and actually for the risky decks, you get an elevated SCR. But for the ventral medial patients, no particular deck was found to be associated with an anticipatory SCR. So a normal person is emotionally reacting to just choices between decks of cards that have different payoffs. And Damasio argues that this emotional system is interacting with the frontal systems and ultimately causing us to choose from one deck or another. Without that intact frontal system, the brain damaged patients cannot wisely adjust their decision making.